sacred lights. Welcome to today's discussion of the gene keys. My name is Shaena. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. If you've been here a few times before, welcome back. I am very excited to go through today's gene key. So just a little bit of a background on the gene keys. They're basically a living wisdom. So all of the gene keys are present in our body, in our DNA, in different ways. You can go online, generate your free hologenetic profile, which will show you the particular gene keys that are a little bit more pronounced, that are in specific spheres. But for the sake of today's discussion, we're just going to be looking at one gene key in particular and just unpacking it, talking about it, feeling into it. The way that the gene keys are designed to be engaged with is through contemplation. So contemplation is kind of that in-between state of meditation where you're really just kind of passively present and like critical thinking. So contemplation is keeping your mind open, keeping your heart open, and allowing the information, allowing the wisdom to basically reverberate back and forth between the mind and the heart, and just allowing yourself to be present to receive whatever comes forward, whatever feelings, sensations, thoughts come forward, rather than trying to understand or comprehend exactly what it means, right? Like a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about are a little bit more esoteric. They're a little bit less concrete as we move through the gene key. So each gene key has three parts. It has a shadow, which is the lower vibrational frequency. It has the gift, which is where most of us will tend to spend our time. And then it has the siddhi, which is really the highest state of self-realization. And when an individual reaches the siddhic state, as we'll see today, it has a really big impact on the collective. And so when we are looking at the gene keys, or contemplating them, we want to do our best to only spend about 10% of time in the shadow, spend the majority of our time in the gift, and then also spend a little bit of time contemplating and engaging with the siddhi. And so another really helpful piece, just to kind of get us started, is to remember to hold on to the notion that all of the states exist within the other, right? So it's like concentric circles. So the shadow is right here. The gift contains the shadow, and then the siddhic state contains all of them. So it's not necessarily a linear movement. It's like an evolution into the next state. So today we're going to be looking at the 60th gene key, which is the shadow of limitation into the gift of realism and the siddhi of justice. It is the programming partner of the 56th gene key. It's part of the codon ring of the ring of Gaia. Physiologically, it relates to our colon, and it corresponds with the amino acid isoleucine. So before we dive into the discussion, let's just take a moment to close our eyes, settle into our body, just coming present to the moment. Just take 3 nice deep inhales and exhales. In through the nose, exhaling out through the mouth. With each exhale, just allowing the mind to relax, allowing that brain matter to soften energetically. Just allowing yourself to come present to what is. Come present to your own energetic field, your own body, your own thoughts. And just noticing what it feels like to have your mind relax, to have your heart open, feeling your feet beneath you connected to Gaia. And then in this state of relaxation, of softening, of openness, just imagine yourself completely enveloped in white light. Anchoring, holding, surrounding your being. And then we're just going to use this white light to hold us as we journey together. So when you're ready, you can open your eyes. So we're going to start in the shadow of limitation, which the shadow of limitation is currently one of the most potent forces that's responsible for pulling humankind in the opposite direction of evolution, right? So limitation essentially holds us where we are and prevents us from moving forward in the direction of evolution. And so this shadow is going to consistently shut down your life receiving faculties, essentially freezing life into ever tighter patterns over the course of time. So if we think about life receiving faculties, right? Like what are those in your life? What are those for you personally? And so when we're in this shadow of limitation, rather than receiving life, rather than expanding, this shadow is going to restrict. It's going to pull us inward rather than allowing us to open and expand. And so it freezes us, right? It keeps us where we are. And this shadow is apparent pretty much everywhere in the current life that we're living in. Just think about all of the places where there's red tape on imagination and innovation, and where all of those energies are stifled, right? So in that context, red tape is referring to the rules, the regulations, the expectations, the shoulds and the should nots. And so maybe just hearing those words that kind of define red tape, it starts to feel heavy, it starts to feel restrictive, starts to feel limiting. And so that's really what this shadow is. This shadow really is limiting us. It's the shadow of limitation. And the shadow prevents us from seeing the built-in mechanisms within life to return to right relationship. There are so many innate mechanisms in nature, in life, to bring things back into right relationship. But when we are in this shadow, when we're engaging and being restricted by this red tape, we start to be limited. We start to disengage from those built-in mechanisms, right? We tend to stay, when we're in the shadow, we tend to be stuck in the mind. And so because of this, it causes us to distrust the flow of life, right? We see these things that need to be put back into right relationship, but because we're in the shadow of limitation, we start to distrust the flow of life, because we know in our heart, we know in the truth of our being that life is inherently built to bring things back to right relationship, but we are actually preventing that from happening However, in the shadow, we're not quite seeing the ways that we're doing that. And so that causes us to distrust the flow of life. We start to feel and perceive that life and evolution gets stuck when we can't break out of set structures and patterns, right? So if you think about the structures and patterns in your life, the grooves that you've created, I'm sure that some of those structures and patterns are really beneficial. However, I also have a feeling that there are probably some grooves that are maybe less supportive, but they're so deep, right? They've been gone through again and again and again that we can't get out of them. And so in this shadow, there's an over-reliance on structures, which leads to the death of magic, right? There's an over-reliance on structures, which leads to the death of magic. And so magic is basically events which do not follow logical, sequential laws. They're unexpected, spontaneous, uncontrollable, and unpredictable. And so when we're overly relying on these structures, it leaves such little space, if any, for magic. And this shadow tends to be the greatest critic of magic because it operates outside of the structure that the shadow is confined by. So because the shadow can't make sense of magic based on its structures and its patterns and all of that, it tends to be really critical of it because that magic is operating outside of the box. And so this shadow in particular, its single purpose is to control the flow of life and prevent anything original from occurring, right? So those structures are in place to control where life is flowing. And because of that, it's preventing anything new, anything original, anything spontaneous from happening. And so we can see this through the abundance of laws that we've created, put in place. And if we look back at the original purpose of these laws, it was to protect the innocent and to ensure that justice was delivered to transgressors, right? However, in the current day, structures have become so bogged down in their own limitations that they no longer operate efficiently or fairly, right? It's like, oh, okay, we're going to just keep creating more and more structures to implement more and more control, but that starts to feel so heavy that you can't actually operate efficiently because you're carrying along all of these structures, all of these rules, all of these limitations. And so the structure, the laws that were initially put in place to support justice are no longer working properly. And so with so many of these different laws in so many countries, they start to prevent us as humans from seeing or behaving outside of the boxes that they create. So the laws, the structures create such strong walls on these boxes that it becomes increasingly more challenging for us to move outside of them. And when we get so bogged down and distracted by these structures, we start to forget our original intentions, right? So we were put on this earth to expand, to explore, to innovate. However, when we get so bogged down and so distracted by operating within the structures, we forget what our original intention was. We lose sight of that desire to innovate, of that intention to expand. However, there's some good news because all structures will eventually dissolve and falter, right? It's in their very nature. Just look back to any great empire. It fell because the structures became so heavy, became so burdensome that they had no choice but to dissolve, but to collapse. And so even though all structures are expendable, right? They're still a necessary part to support the transmutation of the original form, right? Like, in order for transmutation to occur, we need some form of structure, something for the magic to weave within. But it's this 60th shadow that creates an over attachment and an over reliance on the form, instead of highlighting the indwelling, the essence of the spirit or idea that really prompted that structure in the first place. And so I'm going to pause here for just a moment, and I just invite you to take a moment and just feel into maybe the structures or the structures that are holding you back, that feel heavy, that you feel overly burdened by. And then once you're aware of those, maybe just take a moment and think about what was your original intention when you first started to engage with that structure, right? What was at the heart? What drew you to engage, to explore, to enter into that structure? So another element of this shadow is an attachment to the past, right? The shadow of limitation is about the past, because this is a shadow that abhors, it hates the new, the innovative and original, right? This shadow is the nemesis of change. So you can see the power and the strength of this shadow in religion in particular. There are so many different ways, but let's look at just religion and the ways that moral laws are imposed into society through these religious systems, right? So as humans, we kind of tend to be obsessed with morality, and religion tends to be a really great way to see where we can become limited by these moral laws, right? Because they tend to be imposed onto society through the religious systems, whereas cosmic moral laws are existing without the need for systems or structures to necessarily implement them, right? The shadow of limitation loves to control. It loves to feel important by doing something. And the way that it does something in this context is through creating system structures and implementing them to control, to manage the morality of others. When in reality, there is cosmic moral laws. There are cosmic moral laws existing and operating without the need for these systems. And so the more that we try to impose and enforce these laws or limitations, the more reactionary behavior we start to invite in, right? And then that in turn creates a greater need to enforce the rules. And it just creates this vicious cycle and feedback loop that's keeping us stuck in the shadow, right? Because we enforce these laws, and then people react because they want to rebel against the limitation. And then in response to that, we create stricter or more enforcing of those rules. And then we're just back in this cycle. And so limitation, this shadow of limitation, it does keep us stuck. And in this spirit, one of the greatest limitations is actually thinking itself, right? This shadow tries to strangle life at the individual level. So our mind gets used to thinking within certain mental structures, and it can get stuck there because it's comfortable. If you look at like school structures, we're essentially taught how to think, and there's very little room for thinking outside of that. And then we do that over and over and over again over a period of years. And we get comfortable in those mental structures, in that particular way of thinking. And because of that, we start to lose the essence of magic because we're just thinking in familiar patterns and following familiar structures rather than allowing outside thoughts to come in, and rather than leaving space for magic to bring us up and out of self-limitation and into more expansive states of consciousness. And so it's true, there's some discomfort when you come into contact with people, with individuals who operate less confined, less limited by these mental structures, right? It feels a little bit shocking to the system, or it can, but at the same time, it also feels expansive, like you now have access to a greater structure, to something beyond what you typically would have thought of yourself. And so once again, just think back to maybe when you were a child, or maybe a moment that you've had in your life where you felt some of the magic because you were able to get outside of the familiar thinking patterns, of the familiar structures, outside of your more limited way of thinking. So just like in past gene keys, we have two natures of this shadow. We have a repressive and a reactive nature. And so in this gene key, the repressive nature is unstructured, right? So in this nature, in this vein of the shadow, a lack of structure can actually lead to physical ailments, because there are particular structures which hold together the physiological functioning of the organism. And so when there's a lack of structure, those crucial structures aren't operating properly. And so people with this nature, with the repressive nature, they actually need strong structures in life, like family, career, and a sense of direction, because without it, they feel like they're adrift and their potential seems to be wasted. So these are individuals who actually do need some structure, right? So when they have no structure, their limitation actually comes from that lack of structure. However, these people also have a fear of structure and commitment, which prevents them from finding the correct allies or environments for their gifts to bloom. So because they have that fear of structure, they aren't quite able to actually be open to connect to the structure that is going to be most supportive to them, and they become limited by that. And so the other side of that is the reactive nature, which is rigidity. And so this is the shadow expressed through an angry nature, which causes it to become controlling and rigid. So these individuals can't have anyone question them, and they act as though they're beyond reproach. So they get so stuck in their own structures that if anyone comes along and questions them or offers an outside view or opinion, they take it really personally and are very reactive. And so these people have an over-reliance on form and structure to the detriment of the original essence within the structure, like we were talking about earlier, because they assume that any new idea is actually a threat to their security. So whereas the repressive can't really plug in and connect to any structure, the reactive nature is overly obsessed with that structure. So I'm going to pause here before we move into the gift and just invite you to reflect on the shadow, maybe the ways that you feel or have felt it present in your life. All right, so moving into the gift of realism. So people with the 60th gene key in their profile, as I mentioned at the beginning, all of these gene keys are present within us to one degree or another. But if the gene key is in your specific profile, then it's going to have a little bit more potency in your life. It's going to have a stronger impact, a stronger effect on your life. So people with the 60th gene key activated within them, active in their profile, understand the limitations of the world of form, and also know and understand the laws of manifesting within that world of form, right? So they understand, they're connected to the gift of realism. They understand the limitations of being a form, and they also know how to still work within that. So realism in this context is referring to the ability to balance youthfulness and wisdom, right? It's idealism with structure. So the idea of common sense can also be associated with this gift, right? So common sense is something that's inherent to all humans, but tends to be lost whenever a person or a society becomes too bogged down in the frameworks and structures. But it's through this common sense that we evolve and cooperate with creation harmoniously. So as I mentioned back in the shadow, when we are in that place of limitation, when we're overly reliant on the structures, we disconnect from nature, from creation. And so when we move into this gift, we're able to evolve, we're able to cooperate with creation and with life in harmony. And so this gift and people with this gift understand that for anything new to take root in the material world, it has to follow certain laws. The main law being that the material world is based on structure. So yes, structure can be limiting, but structure is also, as I talked about, it's crucial for evolution to happen, right? Like we need some kind of structure in order for things to take root, to take hold. If we think about a house being built, right? Like it has a structure, it has beams that get put up, it has walls and all of that. But if we get so bogged down with like, oh, there's 4 walls, then we lose the ability to see the magic that can unfold, right? And all we see are those 4 walls. That's the shadow. But when we're in the gift, we see those 4 walls and we see the infinite possibilities of what can unfold within those 4 walls, right? We see the ways that those 4 walls, that structure can be evolved. We see the ways that we can decorate, maybe paint the walls, bring in specific furniture, whatever it is. We see the opportunity to evolve from just the 4 walls of structure into something magical, into something magnificent. But we wouldn't be able to do that if we didn't see and understand the benefit and the beauty of those 4 walls, right? If we tried to take the same interior decor and just put it out in an empty field, that's great, but it's very different than when it's put inside of, when it's built upon the structure. And so people with this gift, they understand that there is a lot of red tape in the world. And they also understand that we have to work with it in order to change it rather than simply being reactive to it. So I'll give you another beautiful metaphor that's used in this gene key: the grafting of a young shoot onto a powerful old rootstock, right? Where that young shoot represents the innovation and that old rootstock represents that powerful wisdom, the structure. And so really within this, we're working with the existing laws and traditions of the world. and we introduce change through them rather than in spite of them. I believe there was a call a couple weeks ago just talking about innovation versus tradition. And so this is kind of that same vein, or a similar vein of, we're using tradition to create innovation, but we're not losing sight of the tradition, right? We're not losing sight of the heart, of the root. We're simply taking its essence and finding soft, subtle, gentle ways to work through that, to work with that, rather than in spite of that. And so this gift of realism really is about maintaining the balance between the idea of newness and the structure that's needed to bring that idea into fruition. And so whereas the shadow frequency basically eliminates completely the capacity for magic, this gift frequency has a great capacity for magic, which could seem counterintuitive with the gift of realism. But realism, in its truest form, always involves magic, because the only thing that's needed for magic to occur is a structure and an open mind, right? So people with this gene key, they understand the importance of structure, and they're able to keep their mind open, right? They can see the structure, but they can see what's possible beyond that. And so as humans, we tend to be uncomfortable with uncertainty. Because of that, we don't tend to trust in the magic, which then keeps us clinging to the systems and structures which keep us limited. So that again kind of shows the oscillation between the shadow and the gift. And so another beautiful piece that can come into play with this gift frequency is the idea of language, which is one of the most subtle structures that we have. And people who have this gift can, if they are connected to the gift frequency, they can be masters of language as long as they don't become trapped by it, right? Because in order for something really new to enter the world, language has to be used in a playful manner. We can't be bogged down or weighed down by language. And so when language is used in a playful manner as a means of expressing a frequency, one which holds the energy of change, that's how we can start to bring in, or another way that we can start to use structure to bring in change, to bring in evolution, to bring in expansion. So individuals who are connected with or have this gene key active within their profile can connect with the power of language rather than being trapped by it, rather than being limited by it. They can find playful ways for it to support them. And so the last little bit on this gift, thinking about and noting that this gift does require acceptance of uncertainty and unpredictability of the rhythms of life, right? There are degrees of predictability, of certainty within structure. But as we saw in the shadow, when there's too much reliance on that, we're limited. And so the gift really does require a deep acceptance of the degrees of uncertainty, of the rhythms of life, right? There are natural periods that occur when it looks like nothing is moving, like nothing is shifting, like nothing is evolving, nothing is happening. But within this gift, we understand that there's magic in that darkness before manifestation. It's like when you plant a seed and it doesn't sprout through immediately, right? Sometimes it takes a couple days, a couple weeks, a couple months, a couple years, whatever it is. But this gift, to be embodied in this gift, is to trust and know that the darkness is important, right? And we don't need to interfere with the essential life processes. We don't need to think that we know better than life. So to be realistic really means to accept the natural limitations of being in form without being a victim of them, right? We as humans have limitations. And so when we're realistic, we accept that, but we aren't a victim of them, right? We understand the benefits of structure, but we aren't limited by the structure. So with that, I'm going to pause and just invite you to just reflect on how this gift is feeling in your body, how it's feeling in your system, how it feels to think about working with structures rather than reacting to them. And are there structures that you can soften into a little bit more? Are there places maybe where you've been more reactive? Or are there places where you've been working in harmony with the structures to create expansion? Have you been realistic with yourself? So another piece before we move into the Siddhi, just about the gene keys in general, is that when we're in the shadow frequency, we tend to be stuck in the mind, right? We tend to be stuck in the mental constructs, like we were already talking about in this particular shadow, but most of the shadow frequencies, if not all of them, represent mental limitation, represent being stuck here and a disconnect from the heart. And so as we move into the gift and into the Siddhi, we shift, we bring the energy into our heart. So the gift frequency is much more connected to our heart. The gift frequency has much more of a right relationship between the mind and the heart. And then when we move into the Siddhi, we essentially have transcended our individuality and we're essentially all in that heart, right? Because we're not confined, we're not restricted or limited by the mind. So just kind of keep that in mind as we move into the Siddhi, and also keep in mind that as we move into the Siddhi, it tends to become even less concrete than the other two, and that's okay. So we're letting go of the mind and just allow yourself to feel, just allow yourself to receive, to be in the contemplation of this Siddhic state. So the 60th Siddhi is called justice, but the true meaning in the context of the Siddhi is different from our usual interpretation of the word justice. So when someone attains a Siddhic state, which in reality is a very rare event, they happen spontaneously, they can't be predicted, it's not something that you can actively, achieve. You get there by just continually showing up, and eventually it spontaneously happens. And so when someone does reach a Siddhic state, it creates incredible repercussions and ripples out into the collective field, regardless of whether or not we personally know this person, or even if this person ever comes into contact with another human. Because on an energetic level, the impact is profound, right? Reaching a Siddhic state has a huge impact on the collective energetic. And so when this 60th Siddhi is reached, the fundamental laws that govern physical existence become loosened. Say that again. When this 60th Siddhic state is reached, the fundamental laws that govern physical existence are loosened. And so we tend to think about and imagine the notion of justice in relationship to punishment and reward, because, as I mentioned earlier, as humans, we think in terms of our own morality, right? We think in terms of cause and effect, which is at the root is a result of the dualistic reality we live in, right? We see cause, we see effect. It's how our brain works. We have two hemispheres, a left and a right. Everything that we understand in this physical form, in this reality, is a duality. And so the true concept of justice, however, is not bound by laws at all. And it could be described actually as acausal, which basically means that it happens for no reason that we can see or understand. So if, when we were in the shadow, we were bound, restricted, limited by structures, in the gift frequency, we're learning and practicing working with the structures, in harmony with the structures. When we get to this Siddhic state, structures and laws and all of that have no impact, no effect on that energy. And so in this Siddhic state, the causes do not lead to specific effects. And because of that, there can't be justice in the way that we currently understand it, right? There would be no such thing as duality. And because of that, there would be no separation between people. So in a world where this Siddhic state is fully present, if someone, let's say, murdered someone else, there wouldn't necessarily be justice or repercussions in the way that we understand it, because there actually wouldn't be separation between people, right? So again, we can't really comprehend it. We can't really imagine what this reality looks like, because it's so outside of how our minds work. It's so outside of what we know. And so if you're feeling like your brain is glitching just a little bit, that's totally normal. You're right on track. Welcome to contemplating the Siddhi. It truly does operate outside of any structures or rules or constructs that we are familiar with. And so the Siddhi, it breaks the law, it breaks laws, essentially, is the best way to put it. In particular, it breaks the law of time, right? There's no linearity to time when the Siddhic state is present. So the Siddhi can experience all time in the present. There's no past, present, future. Everything is happening all at the same time, which again doesn't make sense to our brains because it's so different than what we have learned, what we have grown up understanding, what we continually reinforce. And the second rule that this Siddhi breaks is the law that holds form itself together, aka gravity. And so essentially, individuals who have reached this Siddhic state are able to travel through space and time, as I said earlier, but through space. And so we can see this present in mythologies, which come from esoteric teachings and esoteric schools about masters who have attained the body of light or the rainbow body, where they are not confined by the physical anymore, right? They're not confined by the laws of physics. They operate outside of it, right? Remember, this Siddhi is operating outside of all of the structures that we're familiar with, of all of the rules, of all of the laws. And so it's so different. It's so outside of it, supersedes these restrictions. And so with that, there's tons of magic hidden in this 60th Siddhi, true magic, because it is acausal. It cannot be learned, it cannot be mastered or imitated. It just happens. And so every time the Siddhic state is attained, magic comes pouring through the individual's being, and they become a phenomenon and a symbol of breaking the laws of form, right? So a Siddhic state is reached, and it's just a huge pouring in of magic, because the structures, the restrictions, the limitations are gone. And so magic is able to flow and move through with complete freedom, with complete flow. So that is the completion. This Siddhi is also nicknamed the Earth Ship Merkaba. And so in certain esoteric schools, this Siddhi has been known as the Merkaba, or the Chariot of Light. And so the true collective Merkaba is the earth herself, right? The spirit of Gaia. And so when the earth disappears, it will do so suddenly, and all the cells that have held the consciousness that we call Gaia will move into another reality. And so only then will we know what true divine justice means. And it won't have any meaning whatsoever on an individual level. And we have zero idea of what this will look like, because we haven't achieved it. We haven't gotten to that point yet. But this idea of the Earth Ship Merkaba, so Merkaba is a beautiful sacred geometry piece, and it essentially holds all of like the light bodies. And so looking at this Siddhi as the Earth Ship Merkaba, seeing the earth as the collective Merkaba, as the collective embodiment, collective representation of this light body, is really beautiful to remind us that we're constantly in connection with this light being, with this light body, and at the same time to remind us that we are not there yet, right? We still have work to do. And so through contemplating these gene keys, all 64 of them, or just a couple, whatever feels good for you, we are able to expand the consciousness beyond the shadow, to move outside of that, to bring in the energetic frequency of the gift, to begin expanding outside of restrictions, outside of limitations, and to understand, to be realistic about not just these big lofty goals or the really sad, depressing shadow heaviness, right? We're able to be the bridge between the two. And so through contemplation of these gene keys, we can start to activate things within ourselves, activate things within the collective, and move in the direction of that body of light, of the Siddhic state, expanding across the globe and essentially dissolving life as we know it, because we have all reached the Siddhic state, right? Like we all become one, is essentially what the Siddhic state teaches us. So with that, I hope that you enjoyed this discussion. If you have any questions, feel free to post inside of the group. I would love to hear what is coming up for you as you contemplate this gene key. If you have other questions about the gene keys, reach out, let me know. I love talking about this stuff. And until then, we will see you next time.